Hi everyone. I think we're about ready to get started. We might have a few more people pop in as we go along, but that should be fine. So I am Lorna Stabler. I'm a research associate at Cascade. I'm going to be chairing the session, and also in the middle I'll be presenting as well. So the webinar is scheduled to last an hour. The way we're going to organize it is we'll have each speaker will speak for about 10 minutes. It's kind of hard to interrupt people on a screen like this. So if it gets to 15 minutes of someone talking, I'll probably just abruptly jump in and ask them to wait until later to carry on talking. After each presenter has spoken, we'll follow on with the next presenter, and then we'll take all questions at the end. If people could pop their questions in the chat box, that would be great. If you've got a question for a specific presenter, try and pop that in with your question as well, so I can get it to the right person at the end. And yeah, everything will be on YouTube afterwards, so don't worry about trying to scribble down kind of particular notes or anything like that. You should be able to access all of the content later. And I think that is all. Oh, I'm sure you will be aware, but we'll be on Twitter as well, so if you want to tweet about the event, you'll find that under the ExChange Twitter as well. So I'm just going to start off by telling you a little bit about kind of what we're doing today and who the presenters are. And we're talking about kind of shared decision-making meetings with families. So that might sound like a little bit of a strange term, but what we mean by that is things such as family group conferencing, which people may be quite familiar with, but also other models that are specifically aimed at trying to include families within kind of children's services contexts in decision-making about their family and about their children. That can also include involving children as well within the process. So as I say, that includes family group conferencing, but there are other models such as family team unity meetings, family decision-making, and lots of other names that all kind of focus around this core idea, but also just other ways that local authorities are trying to use and adapt kind of meetings that involve families in a way that can be more meaningful and can truly include them in those important decisions. I'm not going to go into the whole history of how these meetings came about, but just to say that they came as a kind of reflection of how the system, the kind of children's services system, had started to move away from kind of having that focus on kind of really kind of individual family decision making, and actually was felt to be kind of excluding a lot of families from some of these important conversations and these decisions. The presentations that we're going to have now are going to be kind of on different sorts of meetings. You'll kind of hear that we will talk a lot about family group conferencing, but actually we'll talk overarchingly about decision making as well. We're going to start off with Jonathan Scofield. So some of you may be familiar with Jonathan, others may not, but he is a professor of social work at Cascade and also deputy director here at Cascade as well. He has a long career, sorry for saying that, Jonathan, but compared to me, he has a very long career kind of spanning over 20 years in social work research. He was involved in some of the first research exploring family group conferencing in Wales. A lot of people who were interested in family group conferencing in Wales may have read some of his papers already. Today he's going to talk about a systematic review looking at kind of family decision-making and participative meetings. So Jonathan, I will hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Lorna. Hi, everybody. Let me get my slides up on the screen. So no, I'm not sharing because I haven't done shared screen. That was a bit dull, wasn't it?
You'll get there.
How about that?
Perfect.
Can you now see my PowerPoint slides? Yeah, okay.
Yes.
All right, yeah, so I'm going to talk for 10 minutes about the systematic review that we did of international evidence. So just to introduce this piece of work then, what do I mean by a systematic review? Well, this is based on the assumption that there's always more evidence out there that you don't know about. People will often refer to, local evaluations that have been done. It's quite common for family group conferences and other similar approaches to be evaluated by, for example, people doing some qualitative interviews with participants, or people following up participants sometime after the conference to see what the outcomes have been for them and how's their well-being, what's happened if children gone into care, this kind of thing, but often on one group of people only. Now, what we decided to do in setting out this systematic review is we would only look at comparative studies. So just to be clear, this isn't saying that those studies that look at one group only, or these studies which are only qualitative, are not worth doing. They absolutely are worth doing. If you want to find out about people's lived experience of taking part in, of having social work interventions, it's absolutely essential to do qualitative research. It's the only way, really, you can hear from people firsthand what their lived experience is in their own terms. However, if what you want to find out is how do shared decision-making meetings of all types perform compared to standard services which don't share decision-making with families, then you have to have a comparison group. So we set out to do this study looking at international evidence and only studies which had a comparison group of families who did not take part in these shared decision-making meetings. There had been a systematic review already done of family group conferencing as relatively recently as 2016, but it was only family group conferencing and not looking at other meeting types. And also there was no UK studies in there at the time. And we were aware of some UK studies that had come about since, and we set out, fairly optimistically, hoping that we would find quite a lot more evidence. We did find quite a lot more evidence. So we looked at all types of shared decision-making meetings, lots of different kind of brand names, especially in around the world. You see lots of different terms being used. We also, however, did separate out the family group conferences as named such, because some of the feedback we were getting from people who know the field was that they are some of the most participatory approaches compared to some of the others which are a bit less genuinely participatory. For example, they typically have private family time where families can have their own discussion, their own decisions without professionals in the room. We were not just looking at randomized controlled trials, as sometimes systematic reviews do, but we also looked at quasi-experimental studies, that is, studies that didn't involve randomization, studies which are comparing, broadly similar populations of people with broadly similar family issues arising, but one of which has the shared decision-making meetings, and another which just has the usual social services approaches. And then another thing we did, which wasn't looked at in the previous reviews, we did look at cost effectiveness. Now, very often with research in this area, people only really talk about keeping children out of care. Now, we were keen to move beyond that, because yes, it is important. These approaches arose, many of you will know that family group conferencing arose in New Zealand as a concern about the overrepresentation of Maori children in care. And they were seen as being a much more communitarian, culturally appropriate approach to working with Maori families, which would give the wider Maori families, a chance to have a say in what was going to happen to the child. And a big part of that was indeed about keeping children out of care. When they've been brought in around the world, often that has been a big concern to bring the rates of children in care down. However, some commentators and experts in this field will rightly say the most important thing is that the families have their say. And if the families have their say and the child ends up coming into care with the family's genuine agreement, then that's the best outcome. Absolutely, I would agree. Hence, we also looked at these international evidence of evaluations which looked at family satisfaction and family empowerment, as well as whether or not they kept children out of care. So I'll go on to say very briefly what we found. I should say there was two similar reviews. So the report on the right here is the one that we did, and there's a link in the slides that people can follow up if they want to see the full thing. On the left is a very similar systematic review, which is going on at the same time. Funnily enough, we didn't know about it until it was published, but actually they did some really quite similar things to what we did. And they found exactly the same thing.
Jonathan, can I just interrupt you for a second? It sounds getting a little bit jumpy.
Right.
So either could you try and keep your head still or pop your headphones on, whichever's easiest for you.
I could do either, but I suspect it's probably a jumpy head problem.
Okay, maybe headphones.
I am a terrible fidgeter, so if I sit very still like this, is it better?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a jumpy head problem. So tell me, just give me a shout if my head is being too jerky.
Perfect.
Sorry. Right. Yeah, and do keep me informed. Right. So yeah, two similar reviews at the same time. So very briefly, what did they find? In essence, I'm afraid it's a bit of a dull conclusion. The evidence was mixed, and the evidence was mixed for all outcomes. That was, in our case, that was across 33 studies. We had more studies in our review than the McGinn et al. Review, but the overall conclusion did not change. So the international evidence, unfortunately, is not conclusive that family group conferences do succeed in keeping children out of care, or that they succeed in improving family empowerment or satisfaction, although I should say that there was very few studies that had measured family satisfaction and empowerment using a comparative design. Those that had mixed results. Some found it improved, some found it didn't improve. But there was not very many of them. What do we conclude from this? Now, this is the most important slide, really. So, in essence, what the systematic review tells us is that setting up a family group conference service is not a silver bullet for reducing care. You know, if you're in a local authority or an organization which is particularly concerned about reducing the rates of children in care, that's a complicated thing to sort out, isn't it? And with many different causes to tackle probably all at once. And just setting up a family group conference service is not likely to sort that out. What we found from looking at this international evidence is that there was actually not very much evidence about the quality of service, but it was undoubtedly would have to be a conclusion of this mixed bag of evidence, whereas in some cases family group conferences were improving outcomes, in some cases they were not making any difference or even making children more likely to come into care in some studies. This must be telling us that how well they are done really matters, and that would include the quality of preparation work, which I know is something that Lorna will touch on when she goes more into the kind of mechanisms. How they're used in the local context, really important. I think in particular, this isn't something we got from our review, but from what I know from other studies, in particular, the extent to which the local authority is bought in to the service, genuinely supporting it, and absolutely embedding it in local practice as a credible and real alternative. It is really important, and Kathy's examples in a minute will be interesting to hear about how that works in one local authority example. So in terms of our research, we just need to know a lot more about how quality and context affect outcomes, and that's something that we're hoping to go on to do now with a couple of new studies that are not kind of quite yet confirmed. The last point, as many people in working in this field will say, you know, it's absolutely the case that family participation in decisions about children should be a right. I absolutely would uphold that position. What I think the evidence review shows us that you know that's not necessarily an easy thing to achieve, and that family group conferencing is probably the most family group conferencing and other allied shared decision making approaches, I should say, is probably the best known way of doing this around the world. But that approach is not a silver bullet, and there may be other ways in which we can be increasing families' participation in decisions about children, which absolutely is their right, and we need to work harder on how we fulfill it. Okay, so there at the bottom there is of the next slide is the review that we did. We really need to hear from Lorna though, because Lorna did the accompanying kind of sibling review, which was very much looking in a bit more depth at what actually goes on in these meetings and how they work, as opposed to the overall headline of their outcomes. So I'll shut up now and hand over to Lorna.
Hi, Jonathan. Thanks for that. You can tell that you're a real pro because that was basically exactly 10 minutes. I would not in any way claim that I will be able to be as efficient and clear as you. But I'll just grab my screen up here. It's a little bit fiddly. There we go. Hopefully that is clear enough. Now, there are some diagrams in here because one of the main parts of the type of review I'm going to talk about is to present things in diagrams. I don't expect that everyone's going to be able to see them, so they will be on the slides when they're sent out after the session. I'll probably put a few more in there as well, so people can see in detail kind of what I'm talking about. So I am going to talk about sorry, I've got a hand up. I'll check. I can't see the chat box at the same time as sharing my screen. So if there's anything, is there a problem with anything? No? Okay, cool. Please do let me know if you can't hear me or anything like that. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about a very different type of review than the one that Jonathan talked about. So it's something that's called a rapid realist review. So it's probably easiest to talk about what it's not. So it's not a systematic review in the traditional sense. So what that means is it's not attempting to find all of the evidence around a very particular subject or question within quite narrow parameters. And it's also not focused on excluding different types of data based on their specific kind of study design or the quality of those studies. Instead, there's a broad focus on quantitative and qualitative evidence that can help answer what's called this realist question of what works, for whom, in what context, and to what extent, and how and why. And that's very wordy. But the point of that is to say it's not just about if this thing works, but actually how it might work, what parts of it might work, if there are particular groups that this thing might work for, and other groups that it mightn't work for, and what are the kind of important ingredients in order to make it work. So another element of a rapid realist review is built into that is stakeholder engagement. So you would, at the very beginning, speak with stakeholders around defining what it is that we really want to focus on, but also kind of throughout the review process, rather than only focusing on printed literature, we also engage with stakeholders throughout the process to test what it is that we're finding and how relevant it is to people as we go on. And the final product of the review, as I mentioned at the start, there's some diagrams in there. The final product is less a kind of snapshot of kind of what was found in terms of effectiveness and kind of numbers, which you might have seen in some systematic reviews previously, but actually what's called a program theory. So a kind of model of how we think this might be working and what some of the important factors were in terms of contextual factors, which we'll come on to in a little bit, around how this might work for people. So what did we do? So this was also part of the program of work that Jonathan was doing when he completed his systematic review. But prior to this review, we did what's called a scoping review. So we were looking at what existed out there that could impact on the numbers of children coming in. Rather than looking at a very specific intervention type, we were looking for almost models that were out there that could work in addressing this as a kind of issue of concern. Within that scoping review, we identified these 17 papers that had what's called a kind of shared mechanism. So this was papers that focused on kind of those shared decision-making meetings, and specifically around developing a plan that could help keep a child safely at home, with the right kind of support and the right kind of wider community around this child. So from those 17 papers that were found in the scope and review, we developed what's called an initial program theory. So we extracted data from these papers, not data that talked about how effective the service was, but how it worked and what types of things in this sort of way of delivering these meetings seemed to be important. Not just to lead to that final outcome, but to lead to kind of intermediary outcomes along the way. So I'll show you a diagram in a minute that might make that a little bit clearer. But from these first 17 papers and its initial program theory, what we then did was what's called refining and testing the program theory. So we have this initial kind of mapping of what we think in terms of how this intervention is working. We find then additional papers from supplementary searches. So different to what Jonathan did, these can be anything. So any study design, they can be grey literature, they can be reports from evaluations within local authorities, or other reviews, or evidence from kind of the voluntary sector. But alongside that, we spoke with a focus group of practitioners from two local authorities, and then, sorry, 3 local authorities, and then also a focus group with children and people from Cascade Voices. And then we did supplementary interviews with people who were particularly expert in family group conferencing to unpick what it was that we were finding and kind of refine what it is that we found in the literature. The importance of doing this was that, as Jonathan touched on, a lot of the literature base for family group conferencing and these types of meetings isn't from the UK. So we really wanted to interrogate what it was we were finding and just check that it was relevant to the context that we would want to be applying it in. There is some evidence that kind of interventions from different contexts then taken into a new context don't always have the same effects and don't always work in the same way as they did in the context in which they were developed. So again, so we developed 2 reports from this. That's probably not that clear for people, but we'll send links around. One is a very large report that has all of the diagrams and all of the ways in which we did this, and the findings in really, really very granular detail. It's pages long with all of the appendices, but it has some really, really good contextual information in there. And then on the other side, what you've got is we developed practice guidance as well. So that was really focusing on those kind of key outcomes and what that might mean for practitioners and people making decisions at different points. So that is much shorter and much easier to get through. So what did we find? So as Jonathan kind of touched on earlier, one of the main things is this kind of idea of the importance of 3 stages. So when people talk about a meeting with a family or a family group conference, quite often what they're talking about is that kind of thing that happens on the day. So, they're thinking about people coming together, having private family time, kind of discussing the plan. But what we found in the literature was actually how important these other 2 stages are. So the pre-meeting, so not just a one-off pre-meeting, but actually all of the preparation that goes into getting families and young people to a point where they first want to come to a meeting, feel able to come to a meeting, and feel able to, in that meeting, actually participate. And then there's during the meeting and all of the parts, as we've kind of talked about, that are really important, such as the location of the meeting and how it feels and who gets to choose who's there. And then after the meeting as well. So if you do the first 2 stages, but then at the end, no one follows through on what the plan was, or there's not the services available, actually that can completely invalidate what's happened before. So part of that is recognizing that actually, including people in decisions and then not following through with what's kind of been agreed in the meeting can actually have a really detrimental effect on what's gone before. We then found kind of these key mechanisms, so these key things that seem to be happening in these meetings that could lead to this kind of final outcome of reducing the need for children to come into care. So this first one is, they're very big. This is why they're called kind of key overarching mechanisms. So one is this idea of collaboration and engagement, trust and shame, and participation in decision making. I won't go into too much depth about these now because I'm going to run out of time, but I will come on to a diagram in a moment that kind of shows what we kind of were talking about when we talked about these mechanisms. And then these are just some of the important contexts that came out as being really, really key to consider within any of these kind of interventions. So one that came up in nearly all of the papers was time. So actually, social workers and coordinators and families and local authorities allocating enough time for this work to really be done, and not just thinking, it's a one-off in this kind of very set time frame. Confidence, so people having confidence in the service, but also social workers having confidence in the process. Anxiety, so around kind of particularly professional anxiety around allowing families to take some of these decisions. Yeah, and kind of trust and organizational support, but there were other contexts as well that I think you can find more information about in the report. So this is a diagram that I do not expect everyone to be able to see with lots of small letters on, but it just gives you a little bit of an understanding of what we kind of aim to do with this kind of type of review. So what you've got here is kind of before, during, after. So this is kind of the different stages of the meeting. And then these three key mechanisms here. So this first one is about collaboration and engagement. So what you can see is that, it's important at different stages throughout the meeting. So it's not just, you kind of get people engaged at the beginning, they're willing to take part, and then you forget about that. Actually, that's something that builds over time. And actually, you still need to focus on that at the end. You need to keep people engaged and keep collaborating with people. And then, let's just stop moving on. But yeah, so as I say, that will be in the, that'll be in the slides that Sean said. So this is just one of those mechanisms. So actually what we kind of focused on here, like I was talking about kind of practice-focused guidance, is what each person's role is in enabling that mechanism to work. So actually, there is something around what the social worker and the coordinator does, but actually it's much wider than that. As a kind of collaborative process, it's all about how different people at different points both buy into this, but also kind of do their part in order to make it work. And if someone within this chain isn't able to do that and isn't able to participate in the way that they need to, actually it's very, very difficult to get this mechanism to work and kind of lead to this outcome that we're looking for. In purple, this is some of the context that people kind of mentioned through consultation particularly. Again, I don't expect you all to be able to see and read all of that now. You can read it in the follow-up. So just to end on kind of what we can learn from this. So, there are many ways in which families are excluded from decision making and have been historically, and that's particularly, the case for family group conferencing has been talked about as particularly relevant for families from different ethnic minority groups. But actually, you need to think about these ways in which people have been excluded from decision making and address those in order to enable participation. It's not as simple as introducing a service and then people will feel included. Shared decision making with families is not a one-off. It's not something that happens, once and then it's a participative service. Actually, there is that pre-work and preparation and that genuine buy-in and follow through from the local authority, and the time that it will take to build trust as well. And then finally, introducing a family group conference and service or something similar needs to be done with the local context in mind. So thinking about some of these questions about who the service is for, who is going to deliver it, how's trust going to be developed in the service. And that's something that hopefully Kathy will kind of touch on. There's a reference there, but also we can pop it in the chat. So I'm going to leave it there. I did go over time, sorry for that. So I'm going to hand over now to Kathy. So Kathy, I have had the opportunity to work with on a few different occasions now, and I'm always very impressed by how passionate she is. Kathy is the lead for the Family Group Conference and Service in what is called the Byborough, so Kensington and Chelsea and Westminster. She has she has 20 years experience as a child protection chair, and through that experience she became interested in family group conferencing and how families could be more involved in decision making and more involved in the kind of child protection process as well. So she is going to talk to you a little bit about the service that she leads. So Kathy, I'm just going to hand over to you.
Okay, hello everyone. Yeah, what I'm going to do is I'll talk a little bit about the service that we have, how it's set up, and how it originated in the Byborough, and then give you an idea of how we use family group conferences and the context. And then I'll end up with an example, because I think it's always nice to actually have some real life story that kind of illustrates what we're talking about. So the service in Byborough has been established, gosh, probably 15 years, something of that order, and has grown and developed over that time. What we have as a model for delivery is there's myself and another lead in each, so there's one in each of the authorities, and our FGC coordinators are actually contracted in, so they're self-employed and independent, and I'm sure if you know the FGC model, that notion of the coordinator being separate from the social worker and not part of assessment and everything is quite important. Lorna mentioned the issues of using FGCs across different ethnic groups and communities, and obviously that's an issue that's a very big one for us because our communities are so mixed in the areas that we work in. And one of the things that having a pool of independent coordinators does give us is the opportunity to offer families a choice. So we can offer families a choice of a coordinator who speaks their language, who understands their culture. And that's something that, again, when you talk about the sort of quality of service and how things connect, we find that makes a very big difference when trying to particularly engage with families who may be quite mistrustful of authority and the services that we represent. So that's kind of our model. In terms of a social work model, we use a systemic approach. So family group conferencing fits really very well with that. And actually the aim to really engage the wider family and networks of support around the individuals. I mean, so often social work focuses on a problem in a family. Often, you know, we've all sat in meetings, it even funnels down to usually one parent, the mother. And so there tends to be a lot of that kind of focus. And this is very much wanting to sort of use the family group conference as a means of broadening that discussion and really tapping into the strengths that exist in the family networks. In terms of what I think is significant in terms of a organizational buy-in, you really need to have a commitment to the notion that there are strengths in families that we need to work alongside, that we don't have all of the answers. So commitment from senior management, I think, is very important. If I think about where our coordinators being external to the organisation, I think the role that I have and my counterpart in Westminster is very key, because one of the things, I think there was again, Lorna was talking about confidence and anxiety, and professionals have a lot of confidence and anxiety issues. You know, as social workers, we're very used to being in control of, this is the plan, this is how we're going to do it. And it can be quite scary, I think, for social workers to think of the idea of actually spreading that out and sharing some of that. So I think having somebody internal in the organisation is a very important part of really influencing the thinking and building that confidence in social workers to make the referrals, because you can have a wonderful service, but you know, they have to make the referrals, and coordinators have to be able to work collaboratively. So it's I think one of the descriptions of FGC that struck me as a very helpful one is the sort of a real kind of bridge between our professional world and the family's life experience, the family's world. And, you know, we have different language, we have different sort of ideas that motivate us in those two different contexts. So I think the family group conference really does provide a very helpful kind of bridge between those two things, and both sides of that equation are equally important when you're looking at trying to involve families in this sort of way. In terms of how we offer family group conferences, we offer them pretty much across the board in terms of intervention. So they can be used in child in need, occasionally early help. Funding tends to be a bit of an issue sometimes with that one. In child protection, we use them, and sometimes we use them with families after a young person's come into care around issues on contact, and also when perhaps a family member has taken on the care of a young person, we might then use a family group conference to look at the supports from their network that they need in the task that they've taken on. So I think there's very much that idea, again, it's, you know, that it isn't a one-off event. It can be used with the same family at different points of the journey, really, and the agenda will change, but the mechanism and the process of spending the time to bring people and their networks with you, I think is what the FGC is about. One of the things that we've recently started to do, because normally if we were talking in a child protection context, it would be likely to be a recommendation of a child protection conference, that there's a family group conference in order to feed into the plan, the CP plan. What we've been doing in the last year is offering the option at times for families to have a family group conference instead of an ICPC. So I've got an example of one which I think is quite an interesting illustration of that. And this was a case, a young person, young girl, we'll call her Ella, I've obviously changed names, who was 15. And she was the youngest child and the only child still living at home with her mother, who we'll call Claire. And Claire had mental health issues, and her ability to parent kind of fluctuated according to the state of her mental health. And at the time when this FGC was being considered, what we had was this condition of the home really wasn't good. The young person was coming to school quite unkempt for a young person of that age. We also had that mum had recently gotten into a relationship online, and that there were some concerns around the partner and the partner's behaviour towards this 15-year-old. The partner wasn't living there. Father was in contact with the daughter, but actually living in Fiji, so very, very distant. In terms of the family, there were 2 older adult siblings and a couple of maternal aunts who were around. The problem was, and one of the difficulties was, that mum was really not engaging and didn't want social workers in the house. Mum was also not on good terms with her 2 sisters. So on the face of it, that might seem like quite a discouraging scenario for a family group conference. Equally, there was concern that a child protection conference was really likely to alienate mother even further, because she wasn't seeing us as helpful in our intervention. And so there was quite a lot of discussion about how we could and should approach this. And in fact, what happened in the end, there were discussions, and these were held by my counterpart in Westminster. So there were discussions between her and the mother to say, look, you know, by the way, I should also add that mother had experience of child protection conferences. She'd been to one in the past. So she was very aware and very anxious about that possibility. So the idea of an FGC was put to her. And there was quite a lot of discussion between the FGC lead and mum about how it could work. Mum was very clear that she felt that she would find it really difficult to face her family in an FGC meeting. And I think one of the things that strikes me as well is that often FGCs are sometimes seen as a bit of a soft option, a kind of fluffy option. But they're not easy for families. And that's where the preparation comes in, because an FGC and facing your family and exposing your weaknesses to them is, you know, can be a very daunting prospect. Anyway, long story short, the discussions with mum, she said she thought an FGC could be helpful, but she didn't want to be at it. So she said, actually, if you want to talk to my daughter, and my daughter wants to do it, I'll agree and we'll do it. So in fact, that's what happened. The 15-year-old was very interested in getting the people who because she had good relationships with these aunties and the older siblings. And mum had input into looking at what the agenda was. Once the daughter said yes, she said, well, okay, and I will contribute, but I'll dial in. I don't actually want to be in the room. And in fact, that's what happened. And it was a really interesting shift in the dynamic and the approach, because when we had the FGC, obviously the young person was very central to it, which I think was a huge positive. And the fact that the young person was so much in the fore and the focus enabled mum to accept the help from the sisters, that she actually didn't have a very good one-to-one relationship. Dad contributed from Fiji. Again, it's quite interesting in the last year, where we've been doing a lot more sort of virtual stuff. I think we've come on leaps and bounds and recognize that whereas we might have said, oh, well, so-and-so's not near enough, they can't do anything. Actually, input from other family members can be hugely important in reaching the thinking and the solutions. So yeah, they actually had a very effective plan involving support from the aunts, from the older siblings, and things improved significantly. And the case is now closed to us. We don't have any involvement with it at all. And I think it's, as I say, I thought it was a helpful example of using the FGC in a creative way in terms of looking at the solutions, and particularly the the fact that when you actually do get them together and they have the opportunity to contribute and have their say, it adds a richness of perspective and alternative solutions that very often we don't find, because we tend to operate within our systems. So yeah, that was the example, and I don't know if I'm on time or over time.
Thank you so much for that, Kathy. Honestly, we've had so many questions for you from this that are really relevant and really interesting. Jonathan, would you mind if I went to those ones first and then came to the ones for you? Is that all right? Just to keep it following on. Okay, so Kathy, the first question is, what is the background and qualification or experiences of your FGC coordinators? Obviously, you said you bring them in from outside.
Yeah, the backgrounds vary hugely. So we have some coordinators who are social work qualified, some who have been team managers, some who have been IROs. We also have coordinators who have come in, I mean, particularly when we're looking at a diverse pool, who've come in from community work or who've come in from being interpreters. We have some coordinators with, who are the ones we trained, interestingly, but I'm involved in a coordinator training and accreditation program, which we run across London. And at the moment, my students are, one of them is a contact worker, contact supervisor. One of them, this is a first for us, I have to say, is a police officer. We have had people from a background in finance who have learned about the mod. So they're from all kinds of different backgrounds. And my experience of training them is that sometimes the social workers are harder to train because they want to social work things, and they find it hard to take the social work head off and actually focus on their task, which is, you know, the preparation of people for and the running of the meeting. So yeah, very wide range.
I think that's really helpful, Kathy, especially, you know, one of the things that came out of the review was the importance of being able to match families with someone that they felt, you know, could understand them. And that matching, I think sometimes is very, you know, black and white if you don't have that many different people to choose from. But actually, when you have that diversity of experience, you can really, use that to match.
And I think also, I mean, I've heard, and I've coordinated FGCs myself as well, but I also, you know, I've often heard that coming back from families that they like the fact that it's not a social worker.
Yeah. Okay, big question here. So maybe try and keep it as short as possible, Kathy. But
okay,
have you positioned FGC working within the signs of safety framework?
Working within signs of safety, I think it works very well in terms of that, you know, that concept of establishing circles of safety. So it fits, I think, very comfortably. When I first came across signs of safety, and particularly use of danger statements and things like that, I can't tell you how much time over the years I've spent converting social work concerns into danger statements, because essentially when you have an FGC, it's very much about that accessible language, explaining the concerns in a way that families can understand. So that part of signs of safety has been an absolute gift for FGC services, because it's gotten social workers thinking much more in those sort of terms. And as I say, then that sort of circles of safety works very well.
The next question is from Gemma, and I'll touch on this a little bit as well. So Gemma's question is, where do you hold the meetings? And I think it touches really well on Phil's question, which was the final question. I just want to say, so one of the conversations I remember having was around the importance of where the meeting is held, but also with the social worker around their anxieties of going to a family's home or a community setting, and things like serving hot drinks and what impact that might have, you know, and the safety of that. So actually, I think it's a really, really important question. So do you want to talk a little bit about that, Kathy?
When we have them in real life, which of course at the moment they've all been virtual, and the response of families to that's been quite interesting as well. We would have them in community venues. We wouldn't normally have them in the family home because that kind of shifts the balance. It needs to be a neutral venue. Yeah, so normally it'd be sort of community centres, that sort of place. Sometimes we've had them in hotels, depending on where we've got on a room in a, you know, where is comfortable and where works. But generally speaking, they're sort of community venues, and we give families the choice of where is convenient for them. So sometimes they'll come up with a venue if they belong, sometimes maybe to a particular community or a church or something like that.
So we've got a few more questions for you, Kathy, and then I'll get to the ones for you as well, Jonathan. So Kathy, how common is it for families to refuse the offer of an FGC? What reasons do they tend to give for it, and how do you work with that? So that's a big question, but I think you touched on it, particularly with your
yeah, I mean, you know, families will by no means always accept an FGC, because the other thing, of course, is we give them a choice. That's one of the key parts. This is a voluntary process. You don't have, you know, if it's case conference, this is a case conference, you have to come. With an FGC, it's a voluntary process. They have to agree to do it and consent to do it. So yeah, a fair number will say, no, I don't want. There's so much shame involved in having a children's services social worker at your door. I can perfectly well understand why families, sometimes it's interesting, the seriousness of the situation sometimes needs to be at a certain level before families overcome that reluctance and that shame of sharing their difficulties or revealing their difficulties and weaknesses to their family. That, I think, is usually the big barrier to getting involved in an FGC. And sometimes we can do it by having the conversation, talking to them. I think that's where it's also very important for the social workers to understand it and be on board with it when they explain why they think it might be a good idea. And equally, coordinators are very good at having those conversations and understanding and coming at it from a family perspective, really.
Yeah, I would say as well from the review that we did, that idea of actively minimizing how shaming the experience can be was so important. So actually, who needs to be there? You know, a lot of people who quite often come to these meetings don't need to be there. Not everything needs to be said in that setting. Actually,
yeah, and I think that's, you know, where families have the control over who comes. So, you know, that makes a big difference. That reassures them. The fact that they will see the information that's going to be shared about them before they agree to it being shared with anyone else. So they know what the danger statement is, or, you know, what that is going to be presented. And they have control, you know, they have some input into that. And I think that makes an enormous difference as well.
Yeah. We do have more questions for you, Kathy, but I think a lot of them have been touched on. I mean, Phil.
Actually, one last thing on that point is the other thing with FGC is that there's no new information on the day.
Yeah.
That information that goes out into the preparation that people have had time to look at, reflect on, and share with each other is what's there. So
There's
it's
no
not new stuff coming in. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Kathy. I mean, we could talk about this for ages, but we'll get cut off in a few minutes. So, yeah, Jonathan, there's a couple of questions on there for you. So the first one, which I'd be happy to talk on as well, but probably won't have time, is around the link between 2 points on your presentation. So where there is good preparation and the results were still mixed, if so, why is preparation important? If good preparation has taken place where the results were less mixed, were they more conclusive?
So short answer from the review, the systematic review that we did, we don't know.
Yeah.
There wasn't good enough information in these international studies about the quality of delivery of the meetings. So unfortunately, we don't know, and that's very much live questions that we're hoping to answer in future studies in the next couple of years.
Yeah. And then also from Rebecca, she talked about some of those other outcomes that you measured. So things like family empowerment and satisfaction. Just could you say a little bit about the studies that measured those outcomes and kind of what findings there were?
Yeah, so in both cases, only 4 comparative studies measuring those outcomes. So family empowerment, one study found the shared decision-making meetings improved family empowerment, and 3 studies found no difference. The highest quality study found no difference.
Yeah.
And then for satisfaction, again, 4 studies measured satisfaction, 2 of which favored the intervention group. That is, the shared decision-making meetings resulted in better satisfaction, and 2 of which found no difference between shared decision-making meetings and usual standard social work.
Thanks, Jonathan. So we are going to have to finish around about there. Phil, I just want to say for your question around kind of differences between social workers in their willingness to use FGCs, we carried out an evaluation as well, kind of looking at the implementation of FGCs at a different point. And I would say just anecdotally, there some of those context things that I spoke about were really important there. So actually how comfortable social workers were in kind of sharing with families, how anxious they were within their practice, how they related to their team manager, all of these things really impacted on how willing social workers felt to kind of offer an FGC. But yeah, we probably don't have time to go into that. There's just one final question maybe that maybe Kathy, you could end on, which is just, you touched on it slightly, how the service has been affected by COVID. And we'll end it there.
Yeah, well, for the last year, all of our FGCs, I think bar one, where there was a particular need because of a family member who had a disability, but other than that, they've all been virtual and online. So it's a bit of a kind of, whoa, how do we do this? And there's kind of pros and cons to it, really. In lots of ways, it's worked very well. Families I've spoken to about their experience have mixed reactions, but some of them find it quite comfortable that, they're in their own home. So we've managed to hold them. They've made plans. Obviously, plans are slightly different because of physically what people have been able to do. But I think one of the things is that during the sort of COVID and lockdowns, people have become much more. It's become much more the norm to sort of communicate in that way. So people are, have come along the journey really because that's comfortable. That's how they've been communicating with their family anyway. And in some ways, using the FGC in these situations where people have become quite isolated has, again, even though it's on a virtual platform, has been very effective in sort of preserving those connections. Interestingly, the whole issue about distance, I say a lot of our families have got connections all over the world. And, we've really found how significant people a long way away can be in terms of the discussions and the planning. And, you know, we had one where it was an aunt in Vietnam, and she was the one who volunteered to write the plan, and she was going to do that. And, it, you know, it would have been, it's sort of expanded our thinking on that quite a lot. I think what you lose are the soft, you know, conversations around the edge and the stuff that goes on, but we're sort of moving back towards a hybrid model at the moment.
Yeah, I would say just on that as a final point, in the consultation that we did with young people, which was back in 2019, so before any of this had happened, so many of them said they would like the option to invite people and use Skype and, you know, join in via Skype or, you know, FaceTime. And it was actually, you know, professionals who were uncomfortable with that and didn't know how to use the technology and didn't think it would work. And actually, maybe one of the benefits of the last year is just to show where it can work and where it can work really well to engage people and allow for that wider network of resources to kind of be tapped into. I think that's a great place to leave it. So I'll just say thank you to you, Kathy, for coming along, and thank you, Jonathan, as well. And thanks to ExChange for hosting the session, and for everyone who came along and took time out of their day today. Right. Thank you very much.